This is Hajra. Today I'll be painting another watercolor versus gouache comparison, as so many of you want to work in watercolor and gouache and liked my previous watercolor versus gouache comparisons. And for those of you who've asked, you can support my making more of these art videos via the fan funding link on the right of my channel homepage. I'm a self-employed author-illustrator and appreciate your support. Before we paint, I want to talk again about how watercolor and gouache are different, this time with a focus on their aesthetic differences. These are some relics I have from previous jewelry making adventures. And also I find them useful to explain certain scientific principles that overlap with art to students. I was a physics major in college, and it's very interesting, I think, how science affects everything. So I think it'll help us understand the differences between watercolor and gouache. There's something in physics called Snell's law, is actually named after Snell and sometimes refers to Descartes as well, René Descartes, but it was actually first described by a scientist named Ibn Saul in 984 AD in Baghdad, because they were really into optics and light in that part of the world at that time. And it describes the relationship between the angles of incidence and refraction. And so it talks about light or other waves passing through two different media, like water or glass or air. And in this case, air and some transparent surface like a gem. You see how the light goes into this, and because this is transparent, some of it is reflecting back at me and some of it is going through, and that's what makes this gemstone so shiny. All transparent gems will do this, although of course they do have to be polished to make the best of it, and so think of your watercolor pigments as really polished stones. And now here's an opaque stone, and this is lapis lazuli, and lapis lazuli is not only used as a semi-precious stone, but it's actually also used to grind up and make one of the most expensive blue pigments in the world for many centuries, ultramarine. So if you have ultramarine on your palette, if it's real ultramarine, it'll be this stone ground up. If I move all the opaque stones to one side, it's turquoise, lapis, some other stones I have here, and if I move all of the transparent stones together, you can see that they look very different on camera. The opaque stones look like they have a lot of body and mass, and they look pretty much the same in person as they do on camera, and it doesn't really matter how you light them because they're opaque. This looks very dull on camera, and so do a lot of these other stones that aren't hitting the light just right. But as soon as I move it and get it so that the light hits it, it certainly starts to look so much more luminous than anything on the opaque side. The same thing happens with any of these other gems. And you can make a comparison that the gouache is going to be like the opaque stones because it's going to be very opaque and matte and velvety in any light. And the watercolor is going to be transparent and luminous like a gem or a jewel, and it can actually look extremely beautiful, sometimes even more beautiful than any other medium, but it really does depend on how the light hits it, and it'll look better in person than it does when it's scanned or when it's photographed. Watercolor is not better than gouache, and gouache isn't better than watercolor. They both just have different properties, and you can use them for different paintings. When you're doing something that needs something that is transparent and luminous and very sort of radiant, then use watercolor. And you need something that is opaque and needs to scan well and has a very velvety look to it, then use gouache, and make the best of both of them. And I have been asked before, why don't I just mix watercolor and gouache? Well, you can certainly do a watercolor background and a gouache foreground or vice versa, but if you actually mix the watercolor into the gouache paint, all of it turns into gouache paint because the gouache overpowers the watercolor and it just turns the paint into an opaque paint. But you can use the watercolor separately on some part of the painting and the gouache separately on another part of the painting, and that's how you can use watercolor and gouache in the same painting. So to me, watercolor and gouache are like my parents. You know, they're equal but not equivalent, and it's not a competition. They both shine and come into their own in different kinds of painting and different kinds of subjects. Now the supplies. An HP mechanical graphite pencil, erasers including a kneaded eraser, half mittens if you're a lefty or prone to smearing pencil and paint like me, a 1/2 inch brush or sponge for water washes in the background, plus a size 2 round 1/4 inch angle and small synthetic scrubber brush. You'll also need a water rinsing cup and a clean water cup with a dropper to wet paints on your palette, and a washcloth to meter the water and paint in your brushes. And some hot press or cold press Arches watercolor paper. I'll be using the back, less textured side of some cold press Arches today. I know, it's a French paper, so it's actually Arche, but I'm American, so I keep saying Arches. Let's talk about the paints I'll be using for this. It actually doesn't take very much paint to do an illustration. artist quality paints go a long way because they're very saturated. The watercolor paints that I'm going to be using are in pans. You can use tubes. If you have tubes, you just squeeze it out onto a palette. So I'll be using lemon yellow, manganese violet, and permanent rose. On the gouache side, I'm using the Colors this time. I do have gouache pans as well, but these Colors do work for gouache painting because they're thick and opaque. So if you have them, you can use them. So I've got a cad yellow, a cad red, and a violet. I also have oxgall, which is just a dispersant that I add 6 drops or a swipe across the top into a cup of water to help the paint disperse better and not streak when you're painting with gouache. And I've also got white gouache paint because in watercolor you don't use white, but in gouache you use white to make the colors lighter. So in watercolor you'll use the white of the paper and use water to make the colors lighter. And that's my limited colors for both the watercolor and the gouache. And of course you'll need a palette. So I've got a separate little palette for my white, which I always do, and for my watercolor and my gouache, what I've done here, all the colors from here on out are my watercolor colors, and the colors from on this side are my gouache colors. And you can actually see just even in the palette how these look opaque and these look transparent, because this is gouache and gouache is opaque, and this is all watercolor and watercolor is transparent. And then I can just mix all my colors here. I mix them in the same shape as the color wheel that I have on my paper and that I have memorized in my head, with yellow at the top, purple on the bottom, red on this side, and blue on this side. The colors shown on my color wheel are not only the pure colors I'm using out of the pans, but the mixes from these colors. So I have lemon yellow, permanent rose, and manganese violet on the watercolor side, as well as the oranges made with lemon yellow and permanent rose, the red violet made with permanent rose and manganese violet, and the purpley tans made with manganese violet and lemon yellow. In the center I have the neutral browns made from mixing all 3 watercolors. I do a similar thing on the gouache side. I have the pure swatches of cadmium yellow, cadmium red, and violet, and then the oranges made with cad yellow and cad red, the red violets made with cad red and violet, and the tannish purples made with violet and cad yellow. And again, the center of the wheel is a good spot for swatches of neutrals mixed with all 3 gouache colors. Showing all the possible colors in my limited palettes on these color wheels helps guide my color choices for my painting, as I know exactly what colors I can pick from. Having a limited palette of colors will ensure color harmony and prevent any jarring color placement. I'm all set to paint. A minimal sketch of the Henry Clive pastel painting I'm using as a study for this video has been drawn lightly on the paper. Keep the drawing light and simple. Aim to do more and more drawing and details and rendering with your paintbrush, and just have a simple guiding sketch underneath. This develops your painting and drawing skills and also makes you less reliant on an overly detailed sketch that you might be afraid to cover up or work over in paint. I've got my smear preventing mittens on, and I'm laying down a clear water wash on the gouache side. I'm working around the figure. If I wanted to, I could have used masking fluid or tape or frisket film to mask off the woman and butterfly, but I don't feel like it's worth the trouble, so I'm not going to use it. Now I'm going to lay down my background gouache color. If I wanted a totally even or solid color background, I need to mix a large enough amount of violet to color the whole background. However, oftentimes it looks too boring and monotonous, so I like to just variegate the background color, so it has lighter and darker areas and doesn't just look like a cheap fill color. Even digital artists emphasize how they use gradients or textured fills. What they do is what I'm doing. It's trying to avoid the monotony with interesting texture and color variation. It's subtle in this piece, but it'll still make a difference. And I can always smooth out and fix areas later too, as this is opaque gouache. I add more white near to the top, as the bottom of a piece is usually given more weight and darkness. That's where foliage and other things are more dense. Also, my center of interest or focal point is the woman's face and her interaction with the butterfly. So if I make a lighter area of background there, it gives a sort of subtle spotlight effect where I want to focus the viewer's gaze. Now I'm going to work solely on the watercolor side and complete the gouache side in part 2 of this demo. I'm going to throw in some quick abstract lines with my clear wax pencil on the watercolor side. You can use a candle or white crayon as well. Since the last watercolor versus gouache demo didn't have a background, I want to have some fun with the backgrounds this time. Now I'm going to add a clear water wash. You can also see me lightening some of the pencil lines. This is more important on the watercolor side, as paint will be transparent. Then I can add watercolor paint wet into wet with my manganese violet and some permanent rose, and just watch that beautiful watercolor spread into a lovely, soft, cloudy background. Can you guess where those thin wax lines went? That's where little gossamer white threads seem to be weaving through this transparent background. And to answer a question I've been asked, No, gouache does not work as well with wet into wet effects or resist techniques with wax. It also doesn't work as well with salt effects. Gouache is thicker and opaque and it wants to stay put. Transparent watercolor works better with more effects because it wants to move. Once the watercolor background is dry, I'm going to come back with my small synthetic scrubber brush and soften any undesired hard edges. This isn't terribly necessary, but it does tidy up your outlines, which is something you have to be more careful about when working transparently. Let's start with the shoulder, and since it's soft, smooth skin, I'm going to wet the paper first and add the paint wet into wet for smooth blends. I want her to have a golden rosy color to her, so I'll start with a yellowish skin tone, which is a mix of lemon and permanent rose. Lay it right into the wet paper. I'm not doing a grisaille or value underpainting in this demo. This painting will be easier to do for some of you as a result. I'm just going to build up the values as I'm painting with the color instead. Okay, so now I'm finished laying down the base skin tone. Don't worry, it'll look less yellow and jaundiced when the rosy tones come in over it. I'll also quickly put pure lemon yellow down over the butterfly, just wet on dry, which is wet paint on dry paper because this is a small area and also a butterfly doesn't need the smooth, soft blending that human skin does. The clothes and hair will be done in a loose and impressionist style, which will also make them easier to do than their counterparts in the last watercolor versus gouache demo. In order to do that, I'll just wet the clothes area and lay in splashes of color wet into wet to suggest her sleeve and bodice. Keep it fun and loose. It reminds me of those feather boas I had to wrap around myself for my high school yearbook pictures. They were so tacky. I don't know if many other high schools did that, but it was a pretty dumb idea. My mom came with me for my photos, and she wouldn't let me wear the boa off my shoulders, so I had it hiked up high around my neck, and it looked even stupider. Okay, so I've come back to the dried butterfly, and I'm adding the black lines on the butterfly, wet on dry. Now back to the tacky yearbook dress, and I'm going to define a few edges and the sleeve top, wet on dry this time with some softened edges. Don't over-render it. Every painting doesn't have to be details everywhere. In fact, you'll find that when you render the focal point, like the face and the hand in this case, and leave most of everything else looser, it makes a more powerful and captivating portrait. Many masters took advantage of this, not to be lazy, but because we really do see what we want to focus on in more detail and contrast, and our eyes blur the less important surroundings out. So apply this in art. Let's start building up the skin now. I'm putting down various tones, warmer and cooler, darker and lighter, how I see them and also how they feel right to me mood-wise. I do this wet on dry, then I soften one of the edges with a clean damp brush with just some water in it. The result is one hard edge and one edge that is soft and blends away. This is one of my most used painting techniques, and it works so well to render form. It's like shading from dark to light, hard to soft, but you've actually switched to your paint and a brush. The hand is one of the harder bits. Be careful where the shadows and shapes develop. It needs to look accurate. Look at your hand if you need help placing the shadows. Outlines are not found in nature. They are a lot of fun to emphasize stylistically in comics and other ink illustration and also in a lot of Art Nouveau style art. But unless you want them for style, try to avoid them and render with shading and even really thin edges where it looks like fingers, for example, are outlined. Close up, you can see that I'm still shading and blending out the outline and not actually leaving it there. Henry Clive's piece has these sort of long talon fingernails, which I put in and then I don't like, so I'm giving her a manicure and blending them out so they look shorter. It leaves a few magenta-ish stains in the background right by her fingernails, but luckily my background is purple and magenta, so I don't have to care because it'll blend right in. Now the nails are shorter, I've reshaped the fingertips here and there, and it looks better to me. Vary your edges. Skip some, make them thinner and thicker. It'll keep your whole piece from looking outlined when you want to minimize that effect. Continue up to the neck shadow area and mold the neck and jaw and her earring area with more wet on dry application of skin tones and blending out one edge of most areas with a damp brush. The face is typically divided into 3 temperature zones: yellow and warmer across the forehead, reddish across the eyes, nose, cheeks, and ears where blood pools and shows through thin skin, and bluish and colder around the chin and jawline. With men, it's even bluer and darker there due to shadow from stubble. So I'm going to keep this in mind when I'm doing this study. Even though these colors and temperatures are not In my Clive reference, I'm going to put them in as it'll make the skin glow, especially because I'm working with transparent watercolor. Darkening up the neck area. And watercolor requires numerous color glazes. Basically, you're going to glaze and dry glazes in between until you see what makes you happy. When you get to a place where it looks good, stop. This is important because unlike digital artwork, you do not have an unlimited number of tries. And to me, that's a good thing. It means I have to commit to how something will look and be able to move on. Not only would I miss the paper and water and paint and the feel of the brush on the paper if I painted digitally, I think I might also just be working forever on one piece. So it's a good thing for me that I'm a traditional artist. Now back up to the face to shade and render the features. Remember all the pencil lines and pencil shading that I left out? This is where that drawing is going to keep coming back in the form of pigment shapes. If any edge looks too hard when it dries, you can also go back and soften it with a damp brush, which will work fine with dry paint too. In fact, this paint is sitting over other paint, so it's even easier to lift and blend it. You'll discover that usually it's the very first layers of watercolor paint that touch the paper that are the hardest to lift or remove. Later on, it's easier. And the reference, the woman is paler with a redder cheek. I've chosen to keep her cheeks less rosy and actually heighten the golden color on her forehead and also later her neck, so she harmonizes with the butterfly more. Because I'm a writer too, maybe, I imagine narratives when I paint. They help the painting. Maybe the butterfly is drawn to this woman because she is so fragrant and beautiful and she smells like a rose. Or maybe the more golden hue I'm adding to this woman is because she's a magical fairy in the process of turning back into a yellow and golden butterfly. And maybe the butterfly is the fairy prince in disguise looking for her. I'm sure the first thing he's going to ask her is why she's dressed for a high school yearbook photo. On to the earring, which can be pulled from the shadows on the neck with thin wet on dry lines and then yellow in the center. And while I have yellow on the brush, I might as well add the yellow for her barrette in her hair. Again, all of this yellow helps bond her to the butterfly and tie the whole piece together. More earwork wet on dry, then onto the lips, which will also be wet on dry. Try to save the highlight on the lips. This is traditional watercolor, so you can't add white to the painting. An easy way to save it, or any other small highlight, is just to go over it with a clear wax pencil. I don't know why I've been avoiding it because it seems like such a good idea. Just keep in mind that the wax pencil is permanent, so be precise about where you apply the highlights and think about them. The central lip line is in the shape of a little W across the mouth opening, and the top lip is usually darker than the lower lip in most people. Again, my low-res reference is too small to show this, but if I know this about anatomy, I can put it in my rendering of the mouth in my painting. Putting in the nose wet on dry, and I'll work on it some more later to adjust the nostril, but now I'm going to go work on the eye. And remember, the eye is a round ball sitting in a socket, so shade the eyelid and the lashes like they are round and not lying in a flat line pasted across her head. Henry Clive worked in the very, very early 1900s, so she's a flapper era girl from long ago, so I'm going to give her thin eyebrows. Not only do you change a color palette to make it more limited and resonant with you for a particular mood, but you can change anything else about a painting to make it something you like more. It's your study, do what you want with it. A little lifting on the lip. Now onto the hair. Like the clothes, I'm keeping the hair loose, fun and easy for this demo. So I'm just going to paint in some general hair area, wet into wet, and then I'm going to define some of the harder edges wet on dry to make it look more like hairsprayed or moussed up hair. Keep it as loose as you want though. Remember, the hair is not the focal point and it shouldn't have as much work and detail. And that's a wrap for the transparent watercolor side. Hope you had fun and learned stuff too. Stay tuned for part 2 of this watercolor versus gouache demo, which will complete the gouache side. Until next time, happy painting!